Resuming debate on the previous debate, the honourable member for Calgary-Crowfoot.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's always a pleasure to speak in the House. And before I get into the substance of the bill, I think I've got to spend some time and talk about the context in which this debate takes place. Because the legislative route that this bill took to get to this very moment says everything about this tired, old, incompetent government. It's really worth taking a moment to examine this, Mr. Speaker. This bill is the second attempt to finally, after over 10 years now, to implement the recommendation of the Deschamps report to transfer criminal prosecution for sexual offenses to civilian court. This was contained in the report that was made and recommendations made to the Harper government in the spring of 2015. So that was just before Parliament adjourned ahead of dissolution for the 2015 election. The Harper government accepted the recommendations, and had it been re-elected that fall, would have had the opportunity to table the appropriate legislation to implement the Deschamps report. Instead, we have had 3 entire parliaments during which this Liberal government has failed to make this legislative change and to implement that recommendation that Justice Deschamps made in March of 2015. From 2015 to 2019, this government took exactly 0 steps whatsoever to implement this recommendation to address sexual misconduct in the armed forces. Although then Minister Harjit Sajjan did take time to cover up the sexual misconduct of the then Chief of Defence Staff, Jonathan Vance, and the government during that Parliament did take the time to engineer a frivolous and vexatious, politically motivated prosecution of Vice Admiral Mark Norman. During the 42nd Parliament, they also expended no resources trying to deal with procuring important equipment. They did spend time, though, buying rusted-out Australian F-18s while delaying a decision on replacing our own fighter jet fleet. They squandered the entire 4-year majority parliament that they had without addressing sexual misconduct in the military or making progress in procuring ships, jets, other aircraft, submarines, land vehicles, artillery, ammunition, or base housing. So then from 2019 to 2021, they continued to ignore victims of sexual misconduct. Although the resignations of senior officers piled up during that Parliament, they continued to delay procurement as worsening morale began to foment a crisis of recruitment and retention to respond to requests that would start to jeopardize Canada's force posture and readiness in order to respond to requests from allies, all on the eve of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and China's explicit challenges to Canada's Arctic sovereignty and security. Then in the last Parliament, between 2021 and 2025, Canada's military lack of preparedness became undeniable and unignorable. And it was in 2023 that became known that there were 16,000 vacant positions in the Canadian Armed Forces, another 10,000 force members undertrained and undeployable. It was what kept then Chief of Defence Staff Wayne Eyre awake at night, according to his own committee's testimony. And finally, in 2023, after 8 years of neglecting and ignoring the armed forces, other than the occasional morale-sapping pronouncement lamenting military culture, this government finally tabled Bill C-66 and then did nothing to advance it for an entire year. They finally moved it in the House of Commons in the spring of 2024. And as my colleague from Algonquin, Pembroke Renfrew, if I've got her new riding name correct, pointed out that in the fall of 2024, spent their entire legislative agenda avoiding compliance with an order of this House and not advancing this legislation. So, Mr. Speaker, let there be no doubt about this government's lack of seriousness about the Canadian Armed Forces in general, and the problem of sexual misconduct in the military specifically. Their track record over the past 10 years speaks for itself. So right now, as I speak in this chamber, ships are rusting out at sea. Fighter jets that should have been ordered and delivered by now have still not been delivered. We're lucky right now if we can get one submarine in the water for a handful of days per year, and there is no replacement ordered. We have only a handful of operational tanks, barely any even available for training. We don't have air defense systems. New transport and refueling aircraft have been ordered with no plan, no hangars built to house them, no base location decisions made. Howitzers and artillery pieces are entirely lacking, as well as adequate shells. This government has let a production line of artillery shells mothball in a threat environment that was emerging, and now, as Canada and its allies desperately need this ammunition, we don't have the production capacity. We don't have the production capacity to supply ourselves and our allies with desperately needed 155mm artillery shells. That's a World War I munition, Mr. Speaker, the production of which this government partially shut down on the eve of the Ukraine war. Base housing is in deplorable condition, with houses falling apart and a 7,000-unit backlog of personnel waiting to access base housing. Barracks are in horrific, unsanitary conditions. Healthcare is also lacking for many military families. This bill is to address a well-known and well-documented problem with sexual misconduct in the military, which is a factor in the recruitment and retention crisis that we face, and certainly a factor in morale at a time when we desperately need to fill vacancies for almost every single position in all branches of the Canadian Armed Forces. So, as I have said before, let me say something about the men and women in our armed forces. They are among the very best people in this country. I have traveled and visited foreign bases, our operations in Latvia and in England. And these people are the best, Mr. Speaker. Young, extremely young people with extraordinary responsibilities. I met a 19-year-old in Latvia who had responsibilities for training and helping Allied soldiers. Just a 19-year-old kid from northern British Columbia with enormous responsibility and so positive and full of energy and enthusiasm for his work. These are just incredible people, and they deserve our support. They are the best, and they deserve protection. They deserve access to justice when sexual misconduct happens. And so we've heard this already in debate. There's been a lot about culture and culture change in the military. Part of the culture change that needs to happen is overcoming the culture of secrecy and the culture of cover-up. That culture has permeated to the very top levels. We saw the former Minister of Defense covering up the sexual misconduct of the former Chief of Defense Staff. We've seen this type of behavior at the highest levels, and we see it at the unit level, as my colleague had said earlier today. We've had testimony at the Defense Committee from victims of sexual assault who say they cannot access justice because the issue of the lack of access to the civilian system, which this bill would ultimately change, but also the inability to get information about themselves to file a complaint. The reflexive secrecy around even members of the Canadian Armed Forces accessing their own information is a part of the problem. And this bill will not fix that, Mr. Speaker. So there's a long way to go in ensuring justice for members of the Canadian Armed Forces who are victims of sexual misconduct. And Mr. Speaker, it's not like civilian access to justice for sexual assault victims is assured. Far from it. We see over and over again how repeat violent offenders are automatically granted bail over and over again as a result of the liberal bail so-called reforms of Bill C-75, which earlier this afternoon, this very liberal bench, all of the benches entirely voted against, replacing and repealing that law. We've seen under the current government an erosion of effective law enforcement and justice for victims. We see crime levels that we have not seen in decades. We see an acceleration in crime. We see a lack of urgency in appointing judges so that assault victims can get access to trial. And this bill doesn't contain this bill will not fix all of this problem. Yes, this bill contains an important, long-standing, 10-year-old recommendation. And I hope that this Parliament will debate this bill and that we will have a proper debate and come to the bottom of this and conclude it.
Questions and comments. Question and commentary. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I would like to address some of the issues that the member talked about that were outside of the legislation by saying that for the very first time in generations, we have a Prime Minister that is newly elected, that is committed to 2% of the GDP. Compare that to whether it's the former government or the Harper government. The Harper government was one of the largest disgraces in terms of commitments to our military in generations. And that is the fact. You cannot change history. In regards to C-11, I would suggest to the member that he actually take a look at the 48 recommendations. 47 of them are on the way to be finished this year, with the legislative transferring from the military courts to the civil courts being the one that we want to pass, and it's the Conservatives that continuously stand in the road to making that the law of the land.
The Honourable Member for Calgary Crowfoot.
Amazing, Mr. Speaker. So on the very first day of debate, he's saying that a Conservative is delaying passage because we wish to debate a bill. I mean, there's a lot to unpack in that intervention. I will point out to the member that under the previous government, which was the Harper government, the previous government procured what was necessary for our troops and our armed forces at a time when they were at war. They needed new helicopters, they got the helicopters. Mr. Speaker, they needed support, transport aircraft, they got it. This government that has been in power for 10 years has entirely neglected the armed forces and neglected the problem of sexual misconduct in the armed forces.
Question and commentary. L'Honourable Député.
The Honourable Member for Joliette. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech. My question for him is, why did the government take so long before coming forward with this bill? Yes, there was C-66, but it died on the order paper. So for 10 years, the government's been aware that it had to do something quickly, and they haven't. And if you look at the case of General Vance, even under the Conservatives, there had been allegations, and the Liberal Defence Minister 12 times refused to meet with the Ombudsman who wanted to meet about that case in order to eventually come up with legislation, and the Defence Minister refused to even consider it. So what does my honourable colleague have to say about that?
Calgary Crowfoot.
Well, I have no answer for his question, which is why the government spent 10 years ignoring the problem. That would be a question for the government. But the member is absolutely right. They had 10 years. They have been in office for 10 years. It took them 8 years to even table this bill. Then they didn't call it for a year, so it was not debated. It was moved. I think we had maybe 1 day of debate. And then they spent 6 months of House time avoiding an order of Parliament, during which time the bill could have been called and debated. So the member is absolutely right to point out that this government has had 10 years to do this, and they failed.
Comments, the Honourable Member for Selkirk Interlake Eastman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague for his great speech here today, laying out all the problems and why we don't trust this Liberal government and why Canadians don't trust them either to deliver for our Canadian Armed Forces. Now, the member used to sit on the Defence Committee, and we sat there and watched the Liberals try to prevent the Defence Committee to study why Harjit Sajjan and Jonathan Vance and Justin Trudeau and Katie Telford and Estrada Estravis covered up Jonathan Vance's sexual misconduct against another serving member of the Canadian Armed Forces. And I'd ask him to speak to why they would cover this up rather than deal with it and wait 10 years to finally come forward with a bill.
The Honourable Member for Calgary Crowfoot.
Again, that's a great question, and it's one that I can't answer. That's a question for the government. Why did they wait so long to implement this recommendation? But the very fact that the government, including the Prime Minister, including the Minister, spent all of the resources that they did trying to cover up sexual misconduct in the armed forces, I think says everything that one needs to know about how seriously they took the problem at the time. It was even after that episode, it was years before they actually tabled the bill that would implement the transfer of complaints to civilian courts. It took them way too long, and I don't think they deserve any credit for having finally reintroduced this.
Resuming debate.